Thank you, Steve. It's an awfully glowing introduction, and I hope I can at least live up to some of it. Okay, I'm trying to talk about a few experiences I've had that have caused me to completely change the way I think about sound, and led me on a path to discover really new things. Okay, so I'm going to try and summarize the first slide here because I don't have it in front of me. And that is, there's several things that are really, really important about sound that it's taken me a long time to learn. And that's what I'm going to talk about. So the first one of these is pitch. I'm a singer, okay, and I play French horn. And to sing well and to play French horn, you've got to have pretty good pitch. In fact, you've got to get pitch to maybe 10 cents. A musical sense is 6 parts in 10,000. 6 parts in 10,000, that's 1 cent. How come that evolved? Evolution is not wasteful. If something is happening that you can do, there's a reason for it. The second one is phase. It's commonly thought that phase is inaudible of above 1,500 hertz. And the third one is attention. Acoustic quality is frequently measured by means of intelligibility, but in fact, attention is actually more important. This is not going to work for everybody in the room, but if I go here away from the microphones and talk with my ordinary voice, most people in the front of the room anyway are going to pay better attention. But just to favor the people with the microphones that are sitting way in the corners where I would never sit if I wanted to hear something, I'm going to use the microphones. Okay? And I'll read this first. For me, sound is not about microphones, speakers, or halls. What matters is, does the hearing the sound move your heart? If not, why not? If yes, how did this happen? And attention is a big part of that. Okay, I grew up in this beautiful modernist house my parents built 20 miles east of Cleveland. I could sing on key, so I got conscripted into theatricals, which was a lot of fun. I was good at making things, this one at the age of 8. So I'm going to talk about pitch here. Singing and playing French horn requires pitch accuracy of 0.3%. I said that already. It has taken me most of my life to understand the fundamental importance of pitch in human hearing. Pitch, which now people call periodicity, is a powerful method to separate signals from noise. My first model for this was presented in 2004 at the ICA conference in Japan. Unknown to me, JCR Lecture beat me to it by 53 years. This is JCR Lecture. He's a brilliant man. I mean, he was really brilliant. Classical music was omnipresent at home. Father was a businessman and a fine musician. We had a Meissner FM radio. That's this guy. And we ate supper with symphonies. We had occasional chamber music in our living room. One day, Father came home with a Cleveite brush sound mirror, the first consumer tape recorder made in the United States. It recorded on black oxide paper tape, and we enjoyed it enormously. With 1913 Boy Mechanic, I made spark coils, Jacob ladders, spark-driven wireless radios. Luckily, we lived in the country. Later, the Radio Amateur's Handbook became my guide to electronics. I learned Morse code and made transmitters and radios, too. But I had no interest in talking with amateur radios buffs. When I was about 11 years old, my mother took me to a bookstore in Cleveland and steered me to the children's section, and I would have none of it. I went to a technical section and selected Marvin Kamra's book, The Art of Magnetic Tape Recording. It was expensive, but she bought it. I mean, it was really expensive in those days. And it had the schematics of most of the current Ampex recorders. It included, I said that, and I read it avidly. At about the age of 12, I built my own tape recorder out of old phonograph motors and radios. In the 1950s, the brush recorder was replaced with a much better Binaural Wallensack. I used my own money to buy an expensive Shure Unidam microphone and used it to record the high school glee club. I was pleased with the results until some professionals recorded one of our concerts with a Neumann condenser and a portable 7-inch mono Ampex. The difference in sound quality was a revelation. Why does a dynamic microphone with reasonable frequency response sound artificial on voices when a condenser microphone does not? Does this have something to do with pitch? Answer, yes, of course. At Harvard, I invested in a pair of AKG D19 microphones, those are the Beatles microphones, and a Viking half-track. My sophomore year, I machined a pulley to make it run at 15 and 7.5. The frequency response of the AKG microphones was good, but they sounded as bad as the Shure. Audio magazines ignored this problem. The rule was, if you don't like the sound of a microphone, don't use it. But the perception is very real. Why was the sound from the D19 microphone muddy, harsh, and distant on voices and not on drums? Finally, I know the answer. Phase and pitch, of course. My sophomore year at Harvard, I met Paul Horowitz. Some of you probably know of him, a junior and electronics wizard. We talked to the manager of the physics machine shop out of a set of keys and made things at night. I found an article about a homebrew condenser microphone, and Paul and I immediately built some. His are beautiful. Mine are not beautiful, but they're beautifully sounding. First was a cardioid, second was a pair of omnis you see on the left. I used them to record the senior recital of Robert Levin and the Harvard Radcliffe Orchestra, conducted by John Harbison. Some of you people might know those names. It was and still is a beautiful recording. In 1966, my senior year, I rebuilt a surplus Ampex 10-inch 15-IPS deck and designed a set of solid-state electronics. I continued to do recordings, mostly of Harvard groups. I entered graduate school in physics that fall and joined the Harvard University Choir, and I sang with them for 10 years. So I'm a choir boy, okay? And that's probably something you should know. In 1969, I met my physicist wife, Harriet Healy-Griesinger. She's been my constant companion, helper, and editor ever since. She even liked this talk. High-quality electret condenser microphones were becoming available. Using Harriet's language skills, we bought 4 of these Sony mics in Japan. They made excellent accent mics. I made a mixer for the accent microphones. It had individual VU meters for each channel, calibrated input attenuators, and panning on each channel. The channel meters were particularly useful for live recording, and most mixers don't have them, or not at that era. In 1972, I was invited to be the recording engineer at a summer music festival. The recording room was set up like this, with left and right speakers on the short wall. The treble was muddy, the bass was mono, the power amp was an early transistor with terrible distortion. I replaced the power amp with a pair of surplus Dynacos, these gorgeous things, and reoriented the room to put the speakers on the long wall at the 1/3 and 2/3 points in the latter wall. The sound was clear and the bass was spacious. Stereo bass. So that's an introduction to stereo bass. To have stereo bass, you need to have low correlation between the left and right channels at low frequencies. I had a tiny oscilloscope with a 1-inch CRT displaying the left-right phase. It was easy to see when the sound was too monaural. But loudspeakers must be carefully placed if spatial bass is to be heard. And I made a paper on this last year in New York, and it's on my YouTube channel, recommended. Distortion. The horrible-sounding transistor amp had less than 0.1% distortion, but sounded awful. The Dynaco had more distortion, but sounded far better. My oscilloscope showed the problem was zero crossing errors at low level. Lesson, beware of distortion specs. The festival stage was boxy. It had multiple reflections from sides, floor, and ceiling. Accent microphones were necessary, but an instrument that's softer than the others will have less reverb in the hall. If you raise its level in the mix, it will sound too close. At one point, I asked one of the famous, in fact, the most famous pianist, why he played so loud that you could never hear the cello. He replied with good humor, "That's your job." And it was. But when I increase the level of the cello, it sounds in your face, and the piano sounds far away. He said with a smile, "No one comes to this music festival to hear the cello." He was right. I had to find a way to make the reverb the same on all the instruments, regardless of how they played. The perception of distance when there is no vision depends on the relative strength of direct sound and reflections. Remember that if you don't already know it. I desperately needed a machine that sounded like a concert hall, but there was a PhD to finish and some work on distortion. My first AES paper was in 1975. The subject was harmonic distortion in tape recorders. With the help of Marvin Kammerer's wonderful book, I designed a circuit that basically eliminated tape distortion. Here's the distortion I got. This is what you get without it. This is what you got with it. And it sounded really good. The circuit worked best with crossfield bias, which requires an extra head on the backside of the recording head. And this one I bought from Tandberg. A few years later, recording tape changed to an oxide with less distortion, and the circuit still worked but was less necessary. A few years after that, recorders were all digital. I had the first PCM F1 in this country, I think, by one of my friends in Japan who brought it to me. Reverberation. To add reverberation, I lugged 2 10-inch tape decks and some speakers into Appleton Chapel, where I sang with the morning choir, and played the offending tape, mixed a new one. That was a lot of work. I borrowed a spring reverb, sounded like a spring, made my plate reverb, sounded worse than the spring. Alternatives to the chapel, simply not successful on classical music. But the cost of digital memory was coming down. It was time to build a digital reverberator. And by the time I finished my PhD, I had a working prototype. That's that. It sounded surprisingly good. A 30-year association with Lexicon and many products followed. But I'm going to talk about headphones. On-location recording requires headphones for monitoring, but recordings mixed with headphones did not sound right on loudspeakers. I used the Brulincare 4133 to equalize my speakers, but it was not possible to equalize headphones by ear. Try it, it's horrible. So I bought a Neumann KU81 dummy head when it became available and used that and the DBX RTA1 to measure and equalize phones to match my dummy head. I figured if the dummy head works, that'll do perfectly. It doesn't. The result was dreadful, worse than no EQ at all. Equalizing headphones at the eardrums to match the spectrum at the eardrums from a frontal loudspeaker is only way to match the timbre of speakers in headphones, and it results in frontal localization without head tracking. That's true. At the time, this required probe microphones. The purple probe was uncomfortable, but it worked. I used the probe, the DBX, and third octave graphic equalizers to make the sound spectrum match, and it sounded perfect. The result was frontal localization without head tracking and perfect timbre. Unfortunately, my headphone equalization does not work for other people. Headphones must be individually equalized at the eardrum if you want frontal localization and timbre that matches a frontal loudspeaker. Now I have a non-invasive method to equalize phones, and you can see my YouTube channel and see how to do it. And I will give you the software if you send me an email. The Toronto Winter Garden Theatre had excellent intelligibility, but it was very dry. In 1991, Neil Munsey asked me to improve the acoustics with the Lexicon 480. With the help of papers by Osborne Krogstad and Manfred Schroeder, I designed a reverberation algorithm that was highly resistant to coloration from feedback. We're still using it. The sense of space was enhanced, the sound was richer, better bass, and the clarity on voices was excellent. Steve Barber named the system Laris. John Bradley from the NRC Canada measured the results of the system on and off. According to the still current ISO 332 standards, the sound was better with the system off. In fact, all listeners preferred the Laris system on. Lesson: beware ISO 332 measures of acoustic quality. They miss the direct sound. Shortly after Toronto, Steve and I, Tom Horrell and I, installed an enhancement system in 51 Walden Arts Center in Concord, Massachusetts. It's still in use, believe it or not. All these white reflectors you see in the surfaces, they were reflective when we got there. And I went to a rehearsal and listened and said, good Lord, the problem is there are too many reflections, not on stage, not too few. So we made all the surfaces you see in the photo absorptive, not reflective. It works. Musicians communicate through vision, the ability to hear notes from other sections, and their ability to hear sound from the hall. Reflections on stage hinder these abilities. This is the opposite of most thinking about stage acoustics. This is changing. Too many reflections eliminate the phase information the ear needs to hear other sections. Too many stage reflections prevent musicians from hearing their balance in the hall as well as other sections. In 1989, at an AES conference, first one in Berlin, Steve Barber and I demonstrated Lares in the Schaubühne Theater in West Berlin. Albrecht Krieger, the Tonmeister at the Berlin Staatsoper, heard it. When Daniel Barenboim became the dirigent at the Staatsoper, he wanted to perform Wagner's Ring of the Nibelungs, but he thought the reverberation was too dry. Krieger suggested they try Lares. Barenboim didn't say no, so I came to Berlin and installed a minimal system on spec with Krieger's help. In Staatsoper, the clarity of music and singing was excellent, really excellent. But Barenboim wanted to sound like Wagner's Festspielhaus in Bayreuth. I knew the reverberation time in Bayreuth was much longer than 1 second we measured in Berlin. I did not know that the clarity for both speech and singing in Bayreuth was exceptionally good. I sang from the forestage and Krieger listened. We adjusted the system to produce enveloping reverberation with good intelligibility. The RT was 1.5 seconds, almost the same as Bayreuth. During the first rehearsal of Rheingold, Barenboim jumped out of the pit and walked around the hall while the singer for Albrecht was upstage. He shouted, "Stop, I don't like it, turn it off." I asked in my best German, "Mr. Barenboim, could you possibly tell me what you don't like?" Answer, "I can't hear the singers. Give you 20 minutes to fix it or it's out." The singers were intelligible. It had to be the sound, the presence that was wrong. The fundamentals of instruments are typically below 500 hertz, and the vowels and formants of speech are typically above 1,000 hertz. So I installed the filter you see above to reduce the strength of reverberation on the formants of the singers by 6 decibels, while keeping the bass and the reverberation time the same. This is difficult to do with natural acoustics. Barenboim listened, sounded perfect, never changed it, and jumped back into the pit. The jury rank system ran for every performance until they tore the theater down. If it ever broke, I get this phone. "Come home, come to Berlin, Barenboim's angry." Singers must be present. What does that mean? Amsterdam also wanted a ring cycle. I adjusted our system with the help of Hartmann Hainchen and Peter Lockhart, the assistant conductor. It's still in constant use. Not in inconstant use, sorry. At one point when Siegfried was singing upstage, I increased the reverberant level just half a decibel. Peter immediately noticed the change. "Siegfried just moved 10 feet farther away," he said. Hainchen heard the change while conducting in the pit. "Put it back," he said. Okay. I learned that reducing the direct to reverberant ratio by half a decibel can completely change the near-far perception. Watch for that. I was watching the singer and did not notice the change. The change in sound is only audible with eyes closed. Otherwise, you hear what you see. To perceive near and far sonically, you have to close your eyes or be looking down at the score. Intelligibility versus attention. Our Lares installation in the old Royal Theatre in Copenhagen was so successful, we were asked if we could increase the intelligibility for actors in the new stage theater next door. We had 64 General X speakers around the hall. I used 2 Microtech Gefell line array mics at the front of the balconies to pick up the actors. That's here and here. At the beginning, and invented a gate that switched the mics on at the beginning of each syllable and off 50 milliseconds later. The 5 most prominent drama directors in Copenhagen listened to a live performance of Chekhov with full audience in Danish, while I switched the system on and off every 10 minutes. At intermission, the verdict was unanimous. The system works. The actors are louder and more intelligible. We hate it. Turn it off. I said, "No one leaves the room till you can tell me why." Finally, after 5 or 10 minutes talking in Danish, "Your system makes the actors sound farther away. Even if the actors are difficult to hear, when they sound close, the audience pays more attention. This is what we want. Fascinated by the observation that closeness predicted attention, I submitted abstracts to the ICA 2004 and RADIS 2004 that I would present an explanation of the physics of that perception. Ha! I didn't have a clue. 2 weeks before the papers were due, I figured that, well, the only mechanism that made any physical sense depended on detecting the periodic peaks in the amplitude envelope of sounds with a definite pitch. Here's a picture. Look at that. There's peaks up and down, and that's just me speaking one. If you have reflections, it looks like this. Okay? So I've invented this what I called a plus-minus detector. It's a correlator, and it worked just fine. It could tell you whether a sound was close or far very easily. The presentation subject to aspects of room acoustics, including the audio and video examples, is now on my website. The examples didn't work before, but I fixed it a few days ago. So, we're going to move on. Binaural recording in live concerts at the eardrum. I went to Vienna after the ICA meeting in Madrid in 2007 to measure my new dummy head. That's this. It has my own pin and my own ear canals and my own eardrum impedance. It was supposed to be me. It is. I also brought a pair of probe microphones you see at the left. When I got to Vienna, I realized I could go to a concert at the Große Musikvereinsaal wearing these probes at my eardrums. I bought a ticket in the last row before the cross aisle for a tourist concert. That's this one. And went to hear Mozart. At intermission, I moved further back. When I played the recordings back with individually equalized headphones with those same probes on my eardrums, the localization of each instrument was sparklingly clear, and that reverberation was absolutely awesome. I have never made or heard a recording that sounded this good until recently when I make them all the time. But that was a revelation, total revelation to me. I had no idea that a really good seat in a really good hall was spectacular and much better than a recording. But I had to play it back without the visual image to hear it. I didn't know with my eyes open. One more vital experience. I was at a concert listening to Beethoven's Second String Quartet, not a great one. Sitting where the second violinist was hidden by the first violinist, I was listening to the second violin line, something I do. I can listen to 2 and sometimes 3 lines at once, and feeling sorry for the player, as I thought the part was boring. My mind wandered from the music to the sound. Why was it possible for me to hear the second violin when I couldn't even see it, even hiding behind the first violinist? Suddenly I realized the neural mechanism I had found for detecting distance, a pitch-based correlator, could explain why I could follow the second violin so easily. More than that, this mechanism would explain why humans are so acutely sensitive to pitch, because you need very high pitch precision to make that work. Comb filters tuned to the fundamental period of an amplitude waveform can separate the formants of a particular speaker or instrument from other signals and from noise. Time for a summary. These phenomena share common questions. I'm not going to read them because of time. All these questions point to a major omission in acoustic research. For more than 100 years, phase above 1,000 hertz has been presumed to be irrelevant to human hearing. The assumption is false. It's true for sine waves, but if you use music or a violin or a clarinet or an oboe or speech, for heaven's sakes, the assumption is completely false. The alignment of phases in the upper harmonics of tones is vital to source separation and localization. Harmonic tones are created. I'm going to play something now, so turn on the sound, please. Are created by pulses of air, the release of a rosin string or strikes of a hammer, and the amplitude spikes created by these pulses cut through noise and reverberation, and my mouse doesn't work. Okay, they have equal sound power, and you can hear how the one with the pulses just goes at you. It draws attention, whereas the whisper does not. Note the periodic high-amplitude pulses in the picture and how easily the voiced sound is heard. Early reflections randomize the phases of these pulses, and the consequences are dramatic. This is an all-pass set of reflections. It happens to have no frequency response or change in level. And the first half of this sentence is normal speech. And then I convolve the second half with this impulse response. Well, if you look at standard measures for this, this impulse has C50 and C80 of infinity, an STI of 0.96, and a RASTI of 0.93. Okay, so it's perfect. It should sound wonderful. Yeah, but it doesn't. So I'm going to play. I'm going to play through just. I'm going to play through just one speaker because otherwise two speakers mess it up. If I record my voice with a microphone close to my mouth, the sound is very close to the ear of the listener, present, very clear. However, if I scramble the harmonics above 1,000 hertz, the sound is very different. It might be perceived as distant or muddy. Okay. So, ear models for detecting proximity. I made a C-language hearing model that had excellent pitch perception and was able to separate two monotone talkers separated by one semitone in pitch. Unknown to me, J.C.R. Licklider had proposed a similar neurology to explain pitch perception in 1951. Recent papers from the field of speech comprehension have come to the same conclusions about the importance of the amplitude waveform of sounds with distinct pitch. They call this process source separation by periodicity. Here are three papers, recent papers, on the subject. You can check it out. I don't have time to talk about them. Proximity, the ability to sharply localize sound sources, does not gradually decrease as you move away from a sound source. It disappears all at once. Rabi et al. Studied the effects of phase randomization on word recognition and noise. A standard word recognition test was performed as phases of speech were gradually replaced by a random function in the presence of noise. Replacing speech by a random function results in a sudden and dramatic change in the error rate at a particular percentage of randomness. This is here. These are different levels of noise. And you can see the error rate doubles right at 0.5, which is plus and minus 90 degrees peak phase variation. Like Arabi, we find that sharp localization proximity disappear all at once when early reflections reach a critical level. That means that as you move away from a small group of performers with eyes averted, the sound stays sharp. At a critical distance, localization disappears in the space of a single row of seats. This is what we call the limit of localization distance, or LLD. I think it's very important. Seats forward of the LLD have proximity. The sound is clear, attention-grabbing, and each instrument can be localized by sound alone. Behind the LLD, sound sources blend together into a fuzzy ball. I don't need to play the sound. We propose that one of the most important measures of acoustic quality in a room or hall is the percentage of seats in which performers sound close and can be sharply localized. And nobody's using this criterion except me, I think, at the moment. But that will change. Actually, Gunnar Engel at Baby on Munich is using it. Oh gosh, what's happening? Oh, it's playing. Oh dear. That's okay. We'll let it play. This is Haydn, recorded by right behind the red lady here. Okay. So I'm going to turn it off if I can. And I'm going to move back 5 rows. Just 5 rows. And in fact, I only had to move around back about 2. But I did 5 just to be sure it would work. Okay, so here's Death of the Maiden, 5 rows further back. We just changed to a different room. You can't hear anybody. Just to let you, I'll play the other one. No, I won't. Maybe I will. Completely different. Okay. Why is the LLD so little known? In human perception, visual localization dominates auditory localization. If we see performers clearly, we're sure we're hearing them clearly. To hear where the LLD occurs in a hall, you need to avert your eyes. Also, your laboratory sound sources need to reproduce proximity. The ISO 3382 measures are often counterproductive because most laboratory sound systems did not reproduce proximity. For example, Manfred Schroeder began to study with binaural technology, but he used 2 loudspeakers playing music that was all mixed together, okay? And he didn't have proximity. That was the big problem with it. He reproduced the whole orchestra with just 2 speakers. Edison, Dick Campbell, Kimio Hamazaki, who's hopefully here, Tapio Loki, and the author all find that to make a believable orchestra sound, you must use a separate loudspeaker for each instrument. When you hear an orchestral recording with just 2 speakers, it sounds artificial. But if you add enough early reflections, the sound blends together and it sounds a bit more believable. This is the sound of a poor seat, not a good one. Most of the standard ISO measures were measured this way. Barron and Marshall's paper, a classic paper on spatial impression, used a single speaker for an entire orchestra. Okay. They found that adding lateral reflections widened the image, and they described what they thought was an improvement to the sound. ASO has since been quoted as beneficial to hall acoustics in nearly every article and textbook, including one that just came out last year. But ASW reduces localization, eliminates proximity, and decreases envelopment. It's not the sound of a poor it's the sound of a poor seat, not a good one. Many experiments in the 1980s and 90s relied on the Denon CD of a supposedly anechoic recording of an orchestra. The recording has no late reflections, but way too many early reflections. Each additional little microphone in the picture adds a reflection with short time delay. Acoustic research concentrated on listening for small differences in the late reverberation, not in the clarity of the sound. Adding strong lateral reflections was found to be slightly helpful. These reflections are harmful when the direct sound is clear. Around 2008, Tapio Loki started making individual anechoic recordings of each instrument and playing them back through separate loudspeakers. He recorded impulse responses from each of 17 positions on various European stages and used these impulse responses and anechoic recordings for audience preference tests. Phase of the direct sound was finally audible. In 2012, he published that a perception he named proximity was both previously overlooked in acoustic research and was strongly preferred by all listeners. All. The only other important perceptions were loudness and good bass. We could have guessed. Where do we go from here? People have known for thousands of years that if you want to communicate with sound, you need to make the direct sound distinctly audible. This is Epidaurus in Greece. 21st century acoustics is finally recognizing the same thing, not just in cinemas where they've known it all along, but in operas, halls, lecture rooms, and classrooms, thank God. Okay. But people still want to hear the wonderful way the sound in a great hall can stir the mind and grip the heart. Should it be an amphitheater like Cologne? This is Cologne. Should it be like a dish like Hamburg? Or should it be an old-fashioned shoebox like Nashville? Incidentally, this is a great hall, one of the very best, courtesy of Paul Scarborough and Chris Blair. We have developed a measure, LOC, that predicts from a binaural impulse response when sound will be heard as proximate. This is the data we use to derive the formula. This is a picture of Boston Symphony Hall. I'm going to talk about this seat, which is DD11. It's got a strong sidewall reflection from this sidewall here. And this is a 3D plot of the impulse response, and you can see that reflection here by the arrow. Okay. If we then measure LOC using my formula, you get this. This is the reverberant energy building up. It builds up very quickly because of that reflection, which gives a strong kick to the reverberation. And this is the level of the direct sound assumed to be constant. And that's too low. You need to have LOC above 3 dB to have proximity. Well, if I delete that reflection by just clipping it out of the impulse response, which you can do, I get LOC equal 5.6, and it sounds beautiful. Then I can oralize that seat, and it's a great seat. I would pay $100 for it. Measuring, modifying, and reproducing all the seats. What I just suggested was modifying an impulse response. Kind of a no-no here, but boy, is it powerful. We need more data Measuring acoustics with Loki's method is complex and expensive, takes most of a night to measure 6 seats. What about all the others? In addition, empty halls and stages sound different than occupied ones. Can we correct for that? Answer, yes. Most current researchers compare different halls and make educated guesses about why they hear what they hear. That includes Loki and some others. We argue that guessing is not sufficient. We need to prove the sonic effects by modifying individual reflections, the reverb time, the direct-to-reverberant ratio, and the loudness. Hey, we can do that. It's easy. Binaural measurements to do this are simple and fast. You can quickly and accurately measure a large number of seats, and in conjunction with the measurement with a first-order spherical microphone, you can investigate the effects of modifying different aspects of acoustics. And this is what we do. This is my new dummy head. This is the spherical microphone that I made 25 years ago. It still works great. And this here is where I put the speaker. And this is the stage at Boston Symphony Hall. And this is where I made this impulse response, although it's not in that seat. It's in a different one. The impulse response belonging to the direct sound is distinct. As you can see, that's the direct sound impulse, followed by early reflections. And we can modify these features and hear how it works. For example, you see the strong peak. I've said that already. We can also correct for equalization errors, adjust the reverberation time, and correct for the directivity of the speaker. And here's a little slide that shows you how you can modify the direct sound. Here's the direct sound of the microphone pointing right at the speaker. You can see the left and right channels are identical. If we simply change the time delay a little here and the level, we can make it sound 15 degrees to the right. That's just ITD and ILD. Everybody knows how to do that. So I made a MATLAB script. You just turn the crank, you plug in the impulse response, turn the crank. Out comes a track for the direct sound from all 5 performers without anything else, a track that contains just the sound of the sidewall reflection without anything else, and a track with all the sound that's not in the first 2 tracks. Okay, you played all 3 tracks at once, you hear the seat, and you do. I have binaural recordings in that seat. They sound terrible. But the reconstruction is very, very close. I'm going to try playing this. First, I'm going to play the reconstruction with all the tracks. A little bit more level, please. More level. This is way too low. So, and I'm going to play it without the first reflection, just not going to play this middle track here. Okay, that's easy. We just moved inside the LLD. That's $100. Okay, here's a similar data for B set 26 in the front of the first balcony. This is 110 feet from the conductor. And you would not expect direct sound to be audible at that seat. That's wrong. In this case, the thing I'm eliminating, this one in the middle here, is reflections from the floor that wouldn't be there if there were audience sitting in those seats. So I'm going to play this one without the without that garbage from the floor. That sounds great if you listen to it on my crosstalk system or on equalized headphones. But binaural techniques are underutilized because of the difficulty of playing them back. Unless headphones are individually equalized at the eardrums, the sound is not frontally localized and the timbre is inaccurate. I have a YouTube video that shows how to use our Windows app. It takes about 20 minutes to do this. I will send you the software and a few concert hall recordings if you want to try it. We are in the process of porting the app to one or more cell phone operating systems. And it works. It's easy to do. We've also developed a playback system that uses crosstalk cancellation to play eardrum-recorded binaural recordings without individual equalization. 2 small speakers are equalized to be frequency linear from 64 to 10 kilohertz. A time domain crosstalk cancellation system creates virtual loudspeakers just outside the listener's ears. The listener's own ear canal resonances are not altered. they hear the recording with frontal localization and correct timbre. You really feel you're there. I have binaural recordings from halls and operas all over the world. Hearing the difference between different seats is beautiful and provocative. It is a wonderful learning experience. If you wanted to learn the difference in sound between different seats, you have to sit down and listen to about 8 or 10. And you'll be really surprised after you're through that, how much that's changed what you think about halls. The setup costs less than $500. The software is free. Send me an email. I have the system here. It's in conference room 5 on this floor. Come and hear it. I'll be there some of tomorrow, probably all morning. So do I have enough data to tell what kind of hall is best? Answer, no. Disney, Hamburg, Indianapolis, Nashville. I'll tell you the ones I like the most. Indianapolis and Nashville. Indianapolis is an old vaudeville theater, and it was redone on the stage by Chris Blair with curtains and blankets in the right places, so the stage is great. And we have a layer system in the part of the hall to give that wonderful late reverberation. It is a great hall. Yes, it has some electronic assistance, but who cares? This is Nashville, Chris Blair's wonderful hall. You have to hear that to believe it. It's great. It's got more great seats than Boston Symphony by some margin, and the reverberation's super. What about this one? Wagner's Festspielhaus of Bayreuth is very special. Note these unusual, very important properties. High ceiling. That means the ceiling reflections are low level and late. Absorbent stage scenery. Absorbent stage scenery. No reflections from inside the proscenium. Niches on the sidewalls, so you get no sidewall reflections. They reflect all the energy back to the stage. And the singers like it. Covered pit orchestra that's gives balanced singers priority. The volume is large for an opera house, but produces a low-level 1.6-second reverberation time. Gorgeous. Bayreuth is optimized for drama. The direct sound from the singers is clear and dominant. Close communication between the singers, audience, and the audience is never compromised. How about this one? Gunnar Engel, wonderful Gunnar Engel, physicist at IBM. Build a hall according to what my plans would be if I'd been involved, and I wasn't. This is a 200-seat shoebox, which is a very bad idea. Don't do it. But he did it. Okay, these seats are wire. They're Eames chairs, so you get no bass loss from the seat back effect. And every surface on the sidewalls is angled, so no reflection from the stage goes to the audience. No first-order reflection. They all go up to the top here, where they bounce around for a while before coming down. It's great. I haven't heard it, but I've heard some binaural recordings. I believe Gunnar when he says it works. 2 brief recommendations to acousticians. Keep LOC greater than 3 dB in as many seats as possible. And this can be quite tricky in shoeboxes. But if you're careful to limit the sidewall reflections, you can do it. That's why the seat in the front of the first balcony works, because all the sidewall reflections are reflected down into the audience where they don't do any good, but they spare the front of the first balcony. So you have this wonderful window of time in which to hear the direct sound. And maximize the reverberant level at times greater than 160 milliseconds when late reverberation is most strongly audible. Shoeboxes and layers do this very well. So this is the end. I hope you have some questions. You're welcome.
Brilliant.
My pleasure. I love doing this.
We have a question.
What? Email address, D.H. Griesinger. You can spell it by looking at the program. D.H. My middle name is Hadley. What? Yeah. It's a family. It's an old family name. Hadley, Hadley. Okay. And it's at Gmail. Ubiquitous.com? Oh, you mean that's Gmail. Okay, you're welcome. And check out my YouTube channel. There's some good talks on it. This is a kind of a combination of all the last 3 or 4 talks thrown together and gone through at super speed.
Yeah, nicely done.
Thank you.
Questions? Who's got questions?
Please.
Yes.
Yes.
You have been so thorough They
Well,
now understand it all.
Yes, but they'll have to remember it.
Yes.
That's the hard part.
All right.
But anyway, I hope with this video I'll get it on my website, on YouTube. We'll see.
Yeah.
My usual is to take the picture of me and put it on one side and put the slides next to me from the computer. It's computer editing. We do it.
Okay. Well, if there's no questions, then Bill, you have the. We have a little presentation. Oh,
Jamie has one.
Oh, Jamie's got a question.
Just out of interest,
Yes.
what does the standard, Jamie Angus, Stanford University, David, all right, what you've got there, the LOC, is a time-dependent measure, isn't it? It's not a static measure.
It depends. Let me just explain. I assume that the direct sound is constant, okay? And now what I'm doing is I'm plotting the logarithm of sound pressure, not the sound pressure, because the ear is sensitive to logarithms. What I'm really doing is trying to count nerve firings, okay? And I'm assuming the nerve firings are logarithmic in some way. That's a stupid assumption. All I can say about this is it works, but that's where I started. Okay, so this is the log. This is the integrated log of the reflected energy as it comes in. All right. And this is the integrated log of the direct sound, which is constant because the sound is constant.
Yeah. So it's a time-dependent measure. You're sort of capturing the temporal effect of the build-up, the reverberations.
In 100 milliseconds.
Yeah. What does your standard measures of direct to reverberation, which obviously are much bigger and longer time measures give you? If you did the normal deep direct to reverberation.
Okay, let me just go back a bit here. There. This is the data that I use to make LOC, but I'll try to answer your question first. The direct to reverberant ratio is just the energy sum of the reflections and the energy sum of the direct sound, okay? And the direct sound happens all at once. The reflections build up with time, but that's not, the direct reverberation doesn't care. It just integrates them separately, okay? And you can argue about what's the direct sound. That's a very interesting question to argue about. Okay, so what I did was, this is the direct to reverberant ratio as measured standard with the standard formula. So this is the direct level versus the total reverberant level. And then I'm going to vary the onset of the reverberation while keeping the DR constant. And I'm going to look for what's the critical level at which localization suddenly disappears as a function of direct reverberant ratio. And I get these data lines. This is for a 1 second reverberation, and this is for a 2 second reverberation. The 2 second is lower down because it takes longer for the reverberation to build up in a 100 millisecond window. There's less of it there. Okay, so you get about 2 dB by going to a longer reverb time. And then I just made a formula that fit these data, and that's the red line and the blue line. And I can tell you, well, why do the logarithm of the pressure instead of just the pressure? The answer is, if you try to do this as a function of pre-delay, pressure doesn't work at all. The logarithm actually tracks that, and pressure does not in any way. And the standard direct reverberant ratio doesn't care when a reflection comes, as long as it comes within 80 milliseconds or 100 milliseconds or whatever you define. Whereas LOC is extremely critical about when the reflection comes. What happens here is that quickly arriving reflection cause the reverberant energy to bounce up really quickly. And if it's not there, the reverberation goes up very slowly.
Yeah, but I'm reckoning those two measures would pretty much have identical traditional direct reverberation.
No, they don't.
They don't.
Well, they do. They have. They do have a difference, but it's not quite the same.
It's small, whereas it's chalk and cheese on your LOC graph.
Yeah. The point is, yes, of course, I start there with a direct reverberant ratio, but then you try doing it as a function of pre-delay and a function of reverberant level, and it doesn't work. The nice thing about LOC, doesn't care what the reverb time is, and it correctly tells you when it goes bad, given the time delay of these reflections. Okay, and there's one other thing. The paper I gave at the IOC in Hamburg. I went into details about, well, this is an interesting story. When I first presented this kind of data in a talk called how important the direct sound is in musical acoustics or something like that. I don't remember the title of it now. I got a question. It was like a lead balloon. It went over and I just saw everybody go, huh? And so somebody raised their hand. Oh, a question. What's your question? What's the direct sound? And I said, first of all, I thought, what a stupid question. And then I thought, I'll answer it. I said, it's probably C5, because acousticians know about C80, C10, C50, C20. Okay, C5, I said, that's the direct sound. Well, then I got to thinking about that and said, I wonder if it is C5. And the reason I did that, I measured a hall where there was a very strong floor reflection. And there was a reflection that came in right at 5 milliseconds. And I said, does LOC want to count that as direct sound, or is it going to count that as reverberation? And so I did the experiment. And that's in the IOC paper, a lot of data on that. And the answer is, if it comes in at 5 milliseconds, it's part of the direct sound. And if it comes in at 7 milliseconds, it's definitely reflections. So it changes LOC exactly as you would expect. So I made a crossover in the LOC code that goes from 5 to 7 in a linear fashion, counting whether it's direct or reverberant. And it worked quite well. Now, the reason you can test that is if you have a back wall and you're listening to something and you back up against the wall, when you're within 2.5 feet, suddenly you get the direct sound, a big improvement. And you can do this. I've been doing it for years. Sometimes in a lousy hall, there's a seat in the very back of the hall against the back wall that's free because nobody wants to sit there. It's a great seat. Go sit there. Direct sound is 6 dB stronger. But then as you move away, 2.5 feet, it dies. Then it's a regular seat. More than you wanted to know, possibly, but okay. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Sean Davis, I think we've met before.
Yes.
I also have a bit of a bee in my bonnet about phase.
Good.
And I wonder if your data and results might be modified by the mic technique, because nowadays we very rarely hear an orchestra. We hear 60 soloists picked up by close mics all over the place.
Yeah.
And I'm a great believer that I think it was Kenneth Wilkinson, the engineer of Decca, years ago told me, if you're going to use a spot mic, you should only open the fader a fraction.
You should only what?
You should only open the fader a tiny amount. Otherwise, you destroy the main stereo picture.
Okay. Let me tell a story about that. I'm a member of the Tonmeister Verband. And one of the big Tonmeister conferences, they set up a recording. They wanted to show a recording of an orchestra, how all the mics were placed and everything. And I guess that was in a picture. They didn't really have an orchestra there. But anyway, they used a Decca tree, of course. That's what they do. And then he had accents, lots of accents, maybe 30 in the orchestra. Okay. And he said, okay, here's the sound of the Decca tree, tink, pink, pink. Okay, blink, blink, blink. Yeah, it sounded like a Decca tree, right? He said, but the instruments just need a little bit more bite, so we're going to add up these Stutz microphones, Stutzen. So one by one, the Stutzen come up. And yeah, the sound of that gets a little bit more forward and a bit more clear, and it's really very nice. And everybody's going, yay, clap, clap, clap. And I stand up and say, could you switch off the Decca tree? Click, click, no difference. Couldn't hear it at all. And then they went through this thing where you had to delay the Stutzen so that they came after the direct sound so that it would sound better. It doesn't work. It always sounds better if you just leave them at 0. What you're doing is you're building a direct sound with Stutzen. And it's very discrete. and it localizes almost as well as a real binaural recording in a good hall, but not that well, okay, in my opinion. And then you have to figure out how to get the right reverberant sound. The Decca tree is very helpful because you start there and you bring everything up and it teaches you where to listen. But it isn't important, and it's the opposite way around. I don't have the resources to use 30 mics, and that I'll leave that to Lasse Nipkoff. I typically will use 16 or something like that for a big piece. And you put them where you need them, right? And then you do have mics overhead that you use. So that's too much explanation. I'm not going to go into recording technique.
Okay, and with that, let's make the presentation.
Thank you.
Yes.
I will sit down.
So, no. We're going to, we would